네, 두 번째 기조연설자로는 다니엘 샤피로 하버드대 협상학 교수님을 연사로 모시고 설득, 소통하는 인재, 세상을 바꾼 협상을 주제로 강연을 청해 듣도록 하겠습니다. 네, 프로페서 샤피로, please.
Thank you. And 안녕하세요. It is an honor and a real privilege to be here today. I want to first say a very warm and deep thank you to Prime Minister Kim, to Mr. Kim, President of Korea Economic Daily, all of you who are here today. I very much appreciated the comments that were just shared with Mr. Brown as well, in particular talking about the importance of education. I think there are two different kinds of education, at the very least. One is educating people about the facts and the figures, the memorization, as your minister shared earlier. The second element of education is how do you actually deal with people? It's one thing, for example, in government to develop good policy, good economic policy, good social policy. It's a very different challenge trying to put those policies into action. So my talk today is going to focus in particular on how do you deal with some of those human elements of negotiation. The talk is going to be drawing upon some of the work that we've built over many years at the Harvard Negotiation Project, and also more recently in a project we're working on with the World Economic Forum, building a global curriculum on conflict management, on negotiation for top-level business leaders and top-level political leaders as well. Equipping these leadership with a common set of tools to deal more effectively with negotiation and difference. One final point on this, my vision long-term, the image I have in my mind is just to imagine if every single kid in our world, as they go through schooling, learn skills of conflict resolution and negotiation. What would our world look like? And as I was thinking about the reflections for today, I've been, of course, watching very carefully the news of what's been happening in this region, the tensions that you're dealing with in terms of South Korea, North Korea, the balloon issue that just happened yesterday. Been watching very closely the islands issue as well. And I couldn't help but think about a situation that you know about much better than I do. Situation that happened in 1976, right at that border between North and South Korea, not far from here. And there was a poplar tree, and I'm sure many of you will recall the situation. But this poplar tree, every year it would blossom and it would grow, and it would block the South Koreans' view of the bridge of no return. So out each year came some of your colleagues, and they went out to trim this tree for security purposes. And this was fine, year after year after year, until August 6th, 1976, when some of the South Korean team went out to trim the tree, and they were met soon by a North Korean contingency who said, "You try and trim this tree, we're going to shoot." And they literally chased away the South Korean team. But this did not stop the South Korean team from trying to trim this tree. This was a security concern. And as you will recall, about 2 weeks later, August 18th, 1976, came along a much larger team of South Korean soldiers, UN officials, and some US soldiers as well, and all there to trim this tree. And they're trimming for about 10 or so minutes, according to what records we've been able to find. And then along comes the North Korean contingency. Lieutenant from the North Korean side walks up to leadership from the South Korean side. "You try and trim this tree, we're going to shoot. We are going to shoot to kill." And as many of you in this room will recall, this turned into a bloody, bloody, terrible situation. There were a number of South Koreans who were injured in this incident. There were a number of North Koreans who were injured. And in fact, there were 2 US soldiers as well. Not just shot, decapitated. Heads chopped off, caught on camera, broadcast around the world. I was presenting this case a couple of years back at my home institution in the United States, and afterward, there was a gentleman that came up to me as I'm walking out of the room. He came up as angry as you can imagine. His face was red. "Professor Shapiro, I don't think you understand. I don't think you understand. I was there. I was at West Point at the U.S. military college at that point in time. I knew those boys, meaning the Americans who were killed. I knew their families. We were not just feeling grief at the loss of our soldiers, he says. We were feeling utter humiliation at the way our soldiers died. And surprise, surprise, this situation then reaches the highest of the high in the United States, the White House, where then President Ford was faced with a very difficult decision. What do you do? What do you do in this circumstance? And you face this day in and day out still. What do you do? And he turns to his lead advisor, then Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, and asks Kissinger advice. What do we do? And according to what records we've been able to find, Kissinger's response, well, you know what I think we should do, Mr. President? No, what do you think we should do? I think we should bomb the North Koreans. And President Ford thinks about it and decides that a more appropriate strategy would be to simply try to cut down this tree. And thus began what is formally known in U.S. military doctrine as Operation Paul Bunyan, named after this folklore hero in the United States, a big guy who chops down trees. Back to the scene now, very close to here, 813 manpower, 813 people. They're 30-person armed platoon, ROK forces, trained in Taekwondo, F-5 fighters, 3 B-52 bombers circling around overhead with the single purpose of what? Of what? Of trying to cut down this tree. And did they do it? Yes. How long did it take? About 1 hour. Was there incident, any further bloodshed? No. But this was literally World War III, almost. And over what? Over a tree? And obviously it's over much, much more than just a tree. And it begs that fundamental question. As you are negotiating, whether it is in the military or political realm, whether it is in the business realm, whether it is with you and your family members negotiating, how do you deal with the emotional dimension? How do you deal with your emotions? And how do you deal with the emotions of other people? So that's what I'll be talking about in our short time together. So the big question again, as you negotiate, how should you deal with emotions? And our work at the Harvard Negotiation Project and our international negotiation program, we really now have been working around the world with leadership of business, leadership from the political realm, dating back to 1978, 1979, offering the process advice that President Carter used at the successful Camp David negotiation. Our organization was there in the early 1990s working with Mandela, the African National Congress, the government. We continue to do a lot of work around the world, and one of the crucial questions we've seen as you negotiate, how do you deal with the emotional dimension? And it's not an easy question, in part because there are so many emotions. I mean, just thinking yesterday, and I'm an outsider to Korea, but I felt it as the balloons were floating from one side to the other. I could feel some of the tension. There are a lot of emotions. How do you negotiate in a very politically tense situation where life and limb are on the line? A lot of emotions. Your personal emotions, group emotions, each side, the international community's emotions. How are you supposed to deal with all of these emotions as there are people sitting at the negotiation table trying to talk? And from my perspective, this is overwhelming. Too many emotions, too many causes of emotions in any negotiation. I mean, even if it's my wife and I trying to figure out where should we take our kids for Friday night for dinner. She says Indian, I say no, Korean food. Even there, a lot of emotions, frustration, annoyance, pride, curiosity, resentment. How do you deal with all of these emotions when dealing with important issues? And our suggestion is to say, don't focus on all of those different emotions as you are negotiating. Instead, turn your attention one step back to a handful of things that we call core concerns. Matters that are important to all of us. And by understanding these 5 core concerns and how to deal with them effectively in a negotiation, it can bring you power. Power in your negotiation. And so I'm going to walk briefly through 3 of these core concerns today so that you have some sense of what they are and how you might utilize them, whether in the business context or in the political context, or if you're like me with your family as well. So let's start with the first of these 5 core concerns, appreciation. Now, you have known, I'm sure, since you were the size of my children, they're 5, 7 years old, we all know that appreciation is a core concern. No one likes to feel not understood, devalued, put down. But it's only been recently that science has really started to catch up with our common understanding of just how powerful appreciation is. Anybody in this room newly married? Anybody newly married? Huh, you're newly married? No, okay, anybody else? We have one person who's newly. Nobody else? How long have you been married for? Just over a year. Okay, you're sort of a newlywed. And is your spouse here as well today? Sorry, is your spouse here? No, she's not here today. That'll make this interesting now. Well, and what's your first name? Henry. Okay. So, there are people, scientists, who study people like Henry. They study newlyweds. And they bring these newlyweds into laboratories. And not just any kind of laboratory. Even in the research literature, they call these laboratories the love lab. So in walks Henry and his spouse into the love lab. And immediately you're hooked up to all different kinds of devices, measuring blood pressure, physiological arousal, facial expression, body language, all of it. And you're sitting comfortably with your spouse on a couch. In walks a research assistant, young college student, who says to you and your spouse, for the next 15 minutes, I'd like the 2 of you to talk about a recent conflict that you have had. You don't need to argue, you don't need to fight about it, just talk about it. Has anybody tried to talk with your romantic partner about a recent conflict without getting back into the conflict? No, okay. Yes, I've actually tried this experiment with my wife, trying to talk about an issue without getting back into the issue, and what do you think happens? You get back into that issue, and very, very quickly. These research laboratories are able to predict with over 90% accuracy who stays married, who gets divorced, 1 year later, 3, 5, 10 years down the line. 10 years. And based only upon 1 minute, 30 seconds of observation. And guess what the primary predictor is of marital stability over time? What do you think it is? Appreciation. And they've boiled it down to a ratio, 5 to 1. Those couples that tend to last over time, as they are talking about their conflict, there are 5 appreciative statements. 5, yeah, I understand where you're coming from. For every single, but I think you're such a jerk. 5 to 1. Those couples that do not last, the ratio is different. The ratio there is actually 1 to 1. 1 appreciative statement for every negative statement. And when reading this research, what struck me is that the problem is not with the negative. The problem is with the lack of positive. And they have replicated this research, changing the methodology within the business context, teamwork context, and surprise, surprise. One of the major reasons that organizations tend to fail, that teams do not work as well as they could, people do not feel appreciated. And I thought to bring this to life, we might talk about an actual situation. Appreciation seems so nice and easy until you put it into the realm of real conflict situations. So part of the work I do is in hostage negotiation, crisis negotiation, and I've worked for some time with the New York Police Department's hostage negotiation team. Thought I might talk briefly about a case based upon a real-life situation. Basic situation. There was a gentleman, about 26 years old, clearly suffering from schizophrenia, delusions of grandeur. He thought he was better than God, so psychological problems. And he's in New York City, in the subway system, on a platform there. And he's just wandering around. And as he's wandering around, he sees a woman. Sees a woman about 20 years old, carrying a baby in her arms. And he sees the woman, he runs up to the woman, he grabs the baby out of her arms, pushes the woman into the train track, runs off into the janitor's closet, locks the door behind him, and the NYPD, the police department, they are called. And they get there about 5-10 minutes later, and they hear on the other side of the door, if this child is an angel, I will love him. If this child is a demon, you know what I need to do. If this child is an angel, I will love him. If this child is a demon, and banging, we're banging on the other side of the door. Open up, open up, open up. What's going on in there? And does our approach work? Yes or no? What do you think? No, of course not. We are approaching this situation like interrogators. You tell us what we need to know. And did it work? No. It only escalated the situation. And it went on. If this child is an angel, I will love him. If this child is a demon, you know what I have to do if this child is an angel. And then all of a sudden, one of the hostage negotiators said, don't worry, the child is an angel. The child's an angel. And did that work? What do you think? Unfortunately, not. Angel, angel, angel. How do you know? How do you know this child's an angel? And all of a sudden, we had now made precisely the opposite error that we had made several hours earlier. Because prior, we were completely failing to appreciate the interrogator. And now we are way on this other side of appreciation, assuming we know more about what that hostage negotiator wants than he does. And that is a dangerous place to be. And it wasn't until we went back to the very basics of what I believe to be the essence of good negotiating, listening, asking good questions, that we actually got somewhere. We learned that this hostage negotiator, from his perspective, he was not crazy. He was trying to save the world. That was his mindset. He was trying to save the world. And once we understood that, it changed our complete approach to the negotiation. Because now we could say, look, I'm the police department. I don't see the angels you see. I don't see the demons you see. But I hear you saying you are trying to save the world. And in our own small way here at the police department, we are trying to save the world too. So why don't you open up that door and let's see if we can try and save this world together. And literally, 3 minutes later, that door squeaks open, out walks gentleman with baby in arms. But it was that challenge. How do you truly appreciate in those moments of tension where appreciation is the last thing in the world you feel like doing? So that's appreciation. For sake of time, let me move on quickly to autonomy. Autonomy, the way we define it, it's the freedom to make decisions without somebody else telling you what to do. The moment your neighbors on any of the sides around you start to feel like you are telling them what to do, and their autonomy starts to feel impinged, they have the negative emotions, and they're less likely to cooperate with you. And just as true, the moment that you start feeling like your autonomy is being impinged by them, in come your negative emotions, all of that history from the past, and you're less likely to cooperate with them. So how do you try to respect autonomy, each side, to make the negotiation work more effectively, to bring positive emotions into the negotiation to the extent you can? And let me close today with one final brief case study on the topic of our third core concern, affiliation. So affiliation is the emotional connection between you and another person, another group, And in negotiation, people often assume, well, if we're negotiating, we're adversaries. In the business realm, if we're negotiating, we must be against one another. In the political realm, if we have a disagreement, we are adversaries. And my response to that is no. Difference is not the same as confrontation. You can deal with difference in many different kinds of ways. And the big question to get the full value out of negotiation, how do you turn an adversary into a colleague? How do you turn an adversary into an ally? And let me close with one case study. There was a long-standing conflict between Peru and Ecuador. The conflict was largely over a small piece of land called Tawinsa, right at the border between the two countries. And the US State Department had called this conflict the longest-standing armed conflict in the history of the Western Hemisphere. A number of international figures had tried to help deal with the situation: the King of Spain, President Roosevelt from the United States, and others, but all unsuccessful. 1998, Jamil Mahuad was elected president of Ecuador. And he decided that his first order of business was going to be to try to create peace between Peru and Ecuador. And just as a side note, this was 1998, and Ecuador, just like parts of Asia, was tremendously affected by the economic crisis at that point in time. And it turns out that President Mahuad had been a student of my colleagues, Roger Fisher's. President Mahuad had been a student of mine a number of years later. He calls up our organization and says, look, I am about to meet with President Fujimori of Peru in just 3 days. I'd love your advice. When I go to sit down and talk with President Fujimori, what do I say? Practically, what do I do? This is not an academic case study, professors. This is real. And the question was, what is the advice? And we were drawing upon these kinds of ideas. Let me share with you 2 pieces of advice, and then I'll close the talk. One piece of advice was to ask advice. Rather than having President Mahuad walk in and say to President Fujimori, here's our position, what's your position? That hadn't worked. For many years, that approach had not worked. The idea was to actually say, look, President Fujimori, what's your practical advice? You've been a president for 8 years. You've worked with 4 of my predecessors. I've been a president for 3 days. What's your advice on how we can realistically deal with this conflict? And you know I cannot simply go back to my Congress and say, we're going to do everything Peru wants. My Congress will never ratify that. What's your realistic advice? And simply by asking that question of advice, it turned these 2 presidents from adversaries facing one another to colleagues, working side by side on a shared problem. And this is something you can do every day in business, in the government realm. What's your advice? How do we get out of this mess that we are in right now? And maybe it's a formal question, or as with dealing with neighbors, maybe the advice is a question that you're asking in very private corners. Second piece of advice that we offered, this was my colleague, Professor Fisher, who unfortunately just passed away about a month and a half ago. But Professor Fisher said to President Mahuad, I want a picture. Get the cameras there. I want a picture of you and President Fujimori. And President Mahuad said, that's fine. There'll be plenty of cameras there. We'll get a nice, stately picture of the 2 of us shaking hands. And Professor Fisher said, no. That's not the kind of picture I want. I want a picture of the 2 of you sitting side by side, pads of paper in hand, pens in hand. Why? As much as these 2 presidents build a relationship, the challenge was, how do you get the peoples to change their perspectives about the conflict? And this was one suggestion on how to do so. President Mahwad said, fine, I'll try my hardest, Professor, see if I can get that picture. And to his credit, President Mahwad did try to get that picture. Came back about a week later, and this picture was on the cover of the Ecuadorian newspaper. And you'll see President Mahwad on your left, President Fujimori on your right, and this picture had a dramatic impact on the entire peace process. Because now the peoples of both sides saw we are no longer adversaries working against one another. We are now colleagues working side by side on shared problems. 77 days later, 10 meetings later, full binding agreement between the two sides that stands to this day. Both of these leaders at that point in time in 1998 were nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for their effort. But to me, what I would love to leave you with is just that image of people working side by side on very difficult, very challenging situations. I'm not saying that the advice I'm talking about, the specific advice today, is precisely what will work here in the region. What I am ultimately saying is that emotions are tremendously important in the negotiation process. And you can choose how you want to deal with those emotions. You can respect one another's core concerns, and you get the positive emotions. You get people who are working effectively together. On the other hand, you can deal poorly with these core concerns, putting people, not appreciating others, disrespecting their autonomy, telling them what to do rather than consulting, failing to build that affiliation, and again, you get predictable but much more dangerous consequences. So it's with that I just want to say a warm and deep thank you. I've learned a tremendous amount during my short time here so far. I look forward to continued conversation, continued learning, and as Mr. Brown had said earlier, I fully concur. Korea is absolutely an inspiration to myself as well. So thank you very much. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Shapiro, for your energetic lecture. 네, 다니엘 샤피로 교수님 대단히 감사합니다.